Hi guys, tonight we're going back to the winter of 1944, into the heart of the Ardennes, where men lived for days and nights in frozen foxholes outside the small Belgian town of Bastogne. This is not a story of battles and glory, it's about the cold that burned through your bones, the silence that felt heavier than gunfire, and the quiet endurance of soldiers who knew there was no relief coming soon. You'll hear the small sounds, the crunch of boots in snow, the breath that turns to frost in the dark, and maybe, just for a moment, you'll feel what it was like to be there. Calm. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. The snow was falling in slow, lazy flakes that night, drifting down through the bare branches like ash from a dying fire. In the foxhole, Private Thomas Evans pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders, though it was stiff with ice, and offered little warmth. His breath came in shallow bursts, and each exhale formed a pale cloud that hung in the air, before fading into the darkness. The earth around him was frozen hard, the walls of the shallow pit lined with a mixture of snow and mud that had turned to brittle stone in the cold. Somewhere beyond the tree line he could hear the distant thump of artillery, but it was far away tonight, muffled by distance and snow. Evans shifted his feet, trying to coax some feeling back into his toes, but his boots had been wet for days. The cold crept up through the soles, a slow, aching burn that he had learned not to fight. It was easier to let the numbness take over. His rifle lay across his lap, wrapped loosely in a strip of cloth to keep the metal from freezing to his skin. Beside him, Sergeant Harris crouched low, his helmet dusted white. "Keep your ears open," Harris murmured, though his voice was barely audible over the whisper of falling snow. Evans nodded, though both men knew nothing would likely happen until morning. The Germans were out there, somewhere beyond the woods, but the night was theirs to endure in silence. Time passed strangely in the foxhole. Minutes felt like hours, and hours like days. Sometimes Evans would close his eyes, only to open them and find nothing had changed. The snow still fell, the cold still pressed in from all sides, and the dark seemed endless. In the distance, a lone owl called, its voice carrying softly over the stillness. The sound was almost comforting, a reminder that life still moved somewhere beyond this frozen world. Evans' mind drifted to home, to the warmth of his mother's kitchen and the sound of rain on a tin roof. He could almost smell the coffee, feel the heat from the stove, hear the creak of the old wooden floorboards. But the wind shifted, and with it came the sharp scent of smoke. Wood, maybe, or something less natural. Harris caught the smell too, his head turned, eyes narrowing. "Somewhere close," he whispered. Evans tightened his grip on the rifle, the weight of it familiar, grounding. The night stretched on, each second a reminder that here in Bastogne, survival wasn't about heroics. It was about enduring the cold, the hunger and the endless waiting. One breath at a time, the dawn came slow, creeping over the horizon in a pale, washed-out light that barely reached the forest floor. The trees stood like black sentinels, their skeletal branches heavy with frost, and the snow beneath them lay unbroken except for the faint depressions of bootprints made days ago. Evans stirred, his joints stiff from another night of half-sleep in the foxhole. His body ached in ways that no stretch could ease, the cold settling so deep into his bones that he felt like he'd never be warm again. Harris was already awake, chewing on a piece of frozen bread that cracked in his teeth like stone. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was always the same. Whatever ration could be pried from the hard, icy packets. Coffee powder dissolved in lukewarm water if they were lucky. Today, there wasn't even that. From their position on the edge of the tree line, they could see a stretch of open field that rolled toward the distant town of Bastogne. Smoke curled lazily from somewhere beyond, drifting against the pale sky. It could have been from chimneys, but both men knew better. It was likely the aftermath of another shelling, or the faint traces of German positions just out of sight. A thin mist clung to the ground, blurring the edges of everything, making it feel as if the world existed in half light. Harris adjusted his helmet and scanned the horizon with the slow, deliberate patience of a man who had learned that sudden movements were invitations for trouble. "We hold here," he said quietly. Though there had been no orders that morning, orders were rare now. Lines of communication were strained, and sometimes it was hours before word filtered down. The foxholes were scattered, each occupied by pairs or single men stretched thin over a perimeter that felt too wide. Somewhere to their left, a cough broke the silence. Evans recognized the sound. It belonged to Miller, a kid barely out of high school who'd been fighting a cold since the start of December. There was no medicine for it, just the hope that it wouldn't turn into something worse. Illness here could be as deadly as any bullet. Around mid-morning, the stillness cracked. A single shot echoed from deep within the forest, sharp and clean. Evans and Harris froze, eyes meeting in silent understanding. One shot didn't mean an attack. Sometimes it was a scout, a warning, or even an accident. But every sound mattered here. Every shift in the air was a signal to be read. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of burning fuel. Somewhere, a vehicle had been hit. Evans tightened the scarf around his neck, feeling the fabric scrape against the stubble on his jaw. It was strange how quickly this life became normal. The dirt under your nails, the ache in your muscles, the way you measured days not by the calendar but by how many times you'd boiled snow for water. Hours passed in that slow, stretching way, the sun arcing weakly overhead before sinking again toward the treetops. By late afternoon, the light turned amber, casting long shadows that reached like fingers across the snow. Harris finally spoke again, his voice low. "They'll test the line tonight. You can feel it." Evans nodded, though he didn't ask how Harris knew. It wasn't a guess. Men who'd survived this long developed a sense for these things, the same way they could smell snow before it fell, or sense a change in the air before the artillery started. That evening they reinforced the walls of the foxhole with chunks of frozen earth, packing them tight against the edges. The rifle was checked, the ammunition laid out where numb hands could find it in the dark. Food was ignored. The hunger was a constant background hum. But it was easier to think about than what might be waiting out there in the blackness beyond the trees. As the last light drained from the sky, the forest settled into its night sounds. Occasional creaks of wood, the rustle of branches in the wind, the distant murmur of voices carried from other positions. Evans pulled his blanket tighter, heart steady but alert. Somewhere beyond the tree line, boots crunched in snow. Too faint to be sure, but enough to make the hair rise on the back of his neck. Harris's hand tightened around his rifle. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, as they had every night since they'd been dropped into this frozen corner of the war. Night in Bastogne carried a different kind of weight than the day. In daylight, you could at least see the trees, the horizon, the gray sky pressing low. At night, the darkness felt alive, thick, watchful, and patient. Evans shifted in the foxhole, trying to find a position that eased the pressure in his lower back, but the frozen ground gave no comfort. The temperature had dropped again, and each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. Harris remained still beside him, eyes fixed on the tree line. They had agreed earlier not to speak unless necessary. Sound carried easily in this brittle air, and the forest was a perfect amplifier. Somewhere far off, the muffled thud of artillery rolled like distant thunder. It was constant enough to fade into the background, becoming part of the night's rhythm. Evans's ears strained for closer noises, the snap of a twig, the crunch of snow under boots, the faint rattle of metal. The longer he listened, the more he began to imagine things, hearing movement where there was none. His mind wandered, unspooling memories to fill the silence. He thought of a warm bed, the weight of thick blankets, the smell of home-cooked meals. Here, warmth was a memory, and food was a ration tin, dented from being shoved into the same pocket for days. Around midnight, a light wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a strange mix of scents. Smoke, damp earth, and something sharper, like metal. Harris noticed it too. Evans saw him turn his head slightly, nostrils flaring. "They're close," Harris whispered, so low it was barely audible. The words were enough to send a jolt of alertness through Evans, though he kept his breathing slow. Minutes passed, long, dragging minutes, until the sound came. At first it was faint, a distant crunch that could have been the shifting of snow under a branch. Then another, closer this time, deliberate. Harris's hand tightened around his rifle, the faint click of his safety disengaging, sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. Evans followed suit, fingers finding their position on cold metal, careful not to let skin touch the bare steel. The foxhole suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as if urging them to stay hidden. The crunching stopped, replaced by silence so complete it pressed against Evans's eardrums. He waited, his muscles tense but unmoving, eyes scanning the black void between tree trunks. Nothing. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, the forest exhaled again. The wind picked up, snowflakes drifting in lazy arcs toward the ground. Harris eased his grip, but didn't lower his weapon. "Could have been a deer," he murmured, though neither of them believed it. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet, broken only by the occasional shiver running through Evans's body. By the time the first pale light of morning began to filter through the branches, his shoulders ached from tension. The sunrise brought no warmth, just a softer gray to replace the black. Harris stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and offered Evans a hand up. "Another night down," he said simply. They both knew there would be more. Nights exactly like this, where the only victory was making it to the next dawn. As they settled into the day's routine, melting snow in a dented pot for water, the sounds of the front reached them again. Sporadic gunfire, the groan of trucks somewhere in the distance. Bastogne was holding, but the pressure was constant, like ice slowly cracking under weight. Evans found himself staring into the trees, wondering if the shapes between them were just shadows or something else entirely. Out here, the line between the two was never clear. The fourth morning in the foxhole began like every other, slow, gray, and without ceremony. The frost had settled thick on the edges of their gear, giving everything a faint white outline, as if the world had been sketched in cold chalk. Evans awoke to the faint crackle of Harris, lighting a scrap of paper in a tin can, coaxing a tiny flame to life. They weren't supposed to make fires, but this one was no larger than a candle, hidden deep in the pit, and its only purpose was to take the edge off the freezing air. The smell of smoke mingled with the scent of wet earth, a reminder that beneath the frozen crust, the soil still lived. Evans cupped his hands over the weak heat, feeling only the faintest relief. "Just long enough to warm the fingers," Harris muttered, his breath curling up like steam. The day's first sounds came from the forest, a slow groan of branches shifting under their icy burden, the distant rattle of what might have been a cart or a truck along some unseen road. From time to time, the air would carry the echo of far-off explosions, dull and heavy, rolling over the hills like an approaching storm. Bastogne was still surrounded. Everyone knew it. The supply lines were thin, and the cold was as much an enemy as the men in gray waiting just beyond the tree line. Breakfast was a half ration, 2 bites of something hard enough to chip a tooth, chased with melted snow. Evans chewed slowly, letting the taste, or what passed for taste, linger. Hunger made even the smallest meal feel like a task worth savoring. By mid-morning, they were scanning the field again, eyes tracing the same landmarks they'd memorized days ago. An old fence post, a crooked tree, a patch of snow that never seemed to melt. Any change in that familiar map could mean movement, and movement could mean trouble. Around noon, the wind shifted. It brought with it a distant hum, low and steady. Harris tilted his head, listening. It grew louder, resolving into the steady grind of engines. Trucks, maybe, or tanks. They couldn't see them, but sound traveled far in the cold. Evans adjusted the strap of his helmet, feeling the metal's chill seep through the lining. He thought of the men in those vehicles, somewhere out there, moving toward a fight or away from one. Either way, their paths might cross soon enough. In the early afternoon, a runner appeared from the right flank, a young man in a helmet too big for him, cheeks raw from the wind. He slid into the foxhole, breathing hard, delivering orders in short bursts. Stay sharp tonight, expect probing fire, no flares unless necessary. He was gone as quickly as he'd come, vanishing back into the white blur between the trees. The rest of the day passed in quiet anticipation. Evans and Harris reinforced their position, wedging more frozen earth into the walls, adjusting the angle of their rifles so they could fire without exposing too much of themselves. The sun dipped low, painting the snow in faint gold before vanishing altogether. Then came the waiting, the long, slow hours when every shadow felt like it was watching, when even the sound of your own heartbeat seemed too loud. As darkness closed in, the forest began to breathe differently. The stillness was deeper now, the kind that came before something moved. Evans settled into his position, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the black edge of the world. He thought of home for just a moment, of a fire in a small hearth, of warmth you didn't have to fight for. Then he pushed it away. Out here, thoughts like that could make you careless. And careless men didn't last long in Bastogne. The first shots came just after midnight, shattering the fragile stillness like glass dropped in a silent room. Evans was already awake, his senses tuned to the smallest changes in the air, so when the crack of a rifle echoed from the tree line, he was gripping his weapon before his mind had even caught up. Harris was motionless beside him, his breathing calm, eyes narrowing as he searched the darkness. The second shot followed quickly, then another, until the quiet night had dissolved into the stuttering rhythm of gunfire. It wasn't heavy yet, not the deafening storm of a full assault, but sharp, probing bursts meant to test their line. Somewhere down the perimeter, someone shouted a warning. The sound carried across the snow, followed by the deeper thump of a mortar. Evans ducked instinctively as the shell landed somewhere behind their position, sending up a muffled bloom of snow and frozen earth. Shards of ice clattered down into the foxhole like hail. The air grew thick with the faint metallic tang of gunpowder, carried swiftly by the wind. Harris leaned close, his voice a low rasp. "They're not coming all the way in, just feeling us out." Evans nodded, but his hands stayed tight on the rifle, eyes locked on the shifting shadows beyond the trees. For long minutes, flashes of light winked between the trunks, muzzle fire, here and gone in an instant, like the forest itself was breathing sparks. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the firing eased. The echoes faded, replaced once again by the creak of branches in the cold, and the far-off groan of artillery somewhere else. The quiet that followed was different now, not peaceful but stretched thin, vibrating with the knowledge that they'd only seen the first step. The cold worked its way back into Evans's bones, reclaiming whatever warmth the tension had lent him. He shifted his position, scanning the horizon again and again, searching for any sign that the night wasn't done with them. Harris kept his rifle propped against the wall of the foxhole, hands folded loosely but ready. "They'll try again before dawn," he said, more to himself than to Evans. He was right. Around 3 in the morning, another volley broke the darkness, this one closer, sharper. The flashes were brighter now, the voices carrying clearer across the snow. Short commands in clipped German. Evans's pulse quickened, but he forced his breathing to stay even, his aim steady. Tracer rounds cut thin red lines through the black, vanishing into the trees. The cold air burned his lungs as he fired, the recoil a familiar jolt. Harris worked beside him without a word, the two men moving in the kind of unspoken rhythm that only comes from long nights of shared survival. Then, just as before, the pressure eased. The forest swallowed the sound, and the snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting through the dim light of the moon. By the time the sky began to pale, both men were exhausted, their muscles tight from hours of stillness, broken only by bursts of motion. The cold seemed sharper now, as if it had been waiting for the fight to end before making itself fully known again. Harris pulled his blanket over his shoulders, exhaling slowly. "This is how they do it, little by little, wear you down until you're too tired to care." Evans didn't answer. He simply stared into the trees, listening to the faint hum of a world still at war, and wondered how many more nights they could endure like this, before something finally broke. The morning after the second probing attack felt heavier than the others, as if the cold itself had thickened overnight. The snow lay undisturbed beyond the Foxhole, yet Evans had the uneasy sense that the forest had shifted somehow, like a picture frame tilted just enough for the eye to notice. Harris sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, watching the horizon as though waiting for it to answer some question. Neither man had spoken much since the final shots faded hours ago. Words took energy, and energy was as valuable as ammunition here. Breakfast was a single cracker each, broken from a ration that had gone soft with damp, followed by melted snow sipped from a dented canteen. The water was metallic and faintly smoky, but Evans swallowed it gratefully. Beyond the tree line, a pale light spread slowly across the field, revealing the same landmarks they had scanned every day since their arrival: the crooked fence post, the bare-limbed oak leaning toward the east, the faint depression in the snow that marked an old shell crater. They studied these shapes not for beauty, but for change. The smallest shift in shadow could mean movement. Just after noon, a thin line of smoke rose on the far side of the field. It was too far to see clearly, but the way it drifted told them it came from something more deliberate than a fire for warmth. Harris squinted through the narrow slit between the Foxhole's packed walls. "Could be a cook fire," he murmured. Evans shook his head. "Too steady. That's fuel, not wood." They let the thought hang, unspoken agreement settling between them. Fuel meant vehicles, and vehicles meant something was coming. In the mid-afternoon, a runner passed along the line, breathless and flushed from the cold. "Dig in deeper," he ordered. "Command says expect pressure after nightfall." His boots slipped in the icy rim as he clambered out and disappeared into the whiteness, his words leaving behind a sharper edge to the air. Evans and Harris worked silently, carving into the frozen earth with entrenching tools that rang like hammers against stone. The deeper they went, the more the ground gave off a dark, rich smell, almost warm compared to the air above. They reinforced the lip of the hole with frozen clods, arranging them into a low wall that would break up their outline against the snow. As dusk approached, the forest began its slow transformation, colors fading into shades of blue and gray until shapes blurred together. The cold deepened, settling in the way it always did, first in the fingers and toes, then in the long bones, until even thought felt slowed. Harris checked his rifle again, laying out extra ammunition where his hand could find it without looking. Evans did the same, fingers numb but precise. The silence grew heavier as the last scraps of daylight bled away. Somewhere to their left, the faint murmur of other men reached them, a short laugh, a muffled cough, small reminders that they were part of a larger line, though each foxhole felt like its own world. Hours passed without incident, until the wind shifted, and carried with it the unmistakable sound of boots on snow, slow, deliberate, and close enough that Evans could feel each step in his chest. Harris leaned forward, his outline barely a shadow against the wall. No words passed between them. The forest seemed to lean in, every branch holding its breath. Then, from somewhere just beyond their sight, a single rifle cracked. The muzzle flash lit the dark for an instant, and the night began again. The first shot was followed by 3 more in quick succession, each echoing through the trees with a flat, hard snap. Evans dropped lower in the foxhole, peering over the frozen edge just enough to scan the black mass of the tree line. Muzzle flashes winked faintly in the dark, there and gone before the eye could settle. Harris had already steadied his rifle, the stock pressed firm to his shoulder. The air between them seemed to tighten, as if the cold itself had become alert. Then came the reply. One of their own positions opening up to the left, the sound deep and rhythmic. The flashes from friendly rifles painted momentary silhouettes against the snow, revealing the shapes of men crouched low, firing toward the shadows. Evans sighted along his weapon, his breath slow, careful not to fog the scope. He saw nothing distinct, just movement, subtle and fluid, blending with the black shapes of the trees. He fired anyway, the recoil biting into his shoulder, the sharp scent of gunpowder cutting through the smell of frozen earth. For a while, the night was a steady exchange of fire, short bursts, pauses, then bursts again, never enough to overwhelm, but always enough to keep the nerves raw. The Germans didn't rush, they didn't need to. This was another test, another reminder that they were still out there, watching, waiting for the right crack in the line. At one point, a flare hissed into the sky from further down the perimeter, bathing the snow in a ghostly white light. For a few seconds, every branch, every mound, every shadow was revealed in stark detail. Evans's eyes caught the outlines of figures moving in the open, darting low between the trunks. He fired twice, but by the time the echo faded, the light was gone, and the forest was once more a wall of black. The gunfire tapered off after an hour, the silence returning in a slow, uneasy way. Harris kept his weapon ready, scanning the dark without blinking. "They'll come back," he said finally, voice flat. "They don't waste nights like this." Evans shifted, rolling his shoulders to loosen the knot of tension there. His fingertips burned as the blood crept back into them. He resisted the urge to speak, letting the quiet settle again, broken only by the whisper of snow falling through the branches. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched, the cold working deeper into every muscle. From time to time, Evans would think he heard movement, just at the edge of perception. But when he looked, there was nothing but stillness. Around what must have been 3 in the morning, the distant sound of an engine reached them. It was faint, muffled by the forest, but steady, moving slowly. Harris frowned, tilting his head. "Truck," he murmured. "Could be bringing them closer." They listened, following the sound until it faded. Whether it had stopped or turned away they couldn't tell. No more shots came. The night drifted on, the darkness heavy, the snow falling thicker now, settling on their helmets, shoulders and rifles. By the time the first pale gray hinted at dawn, both men felt as though the night had been a weight they'd carried together. There was no relief in the daylight, just a shift, from waiting in the dark to waiting in the cold light of morning. Harris flexed his hands and looked to Evans. "Another night done," he said, though his eyes carried the unspoken truth. Each night was harder than the last. The morning after felt as if it had been carved from solid ice. The snow was heavier now, a thick blanket that muted every sound and blurred the edges of the world into soft white shapes. Evans brushed frost from the rim of the Foxhole, the ice breaking off in small shards that tinkled faintly as they fell. Harris was already scanning the horizon, his face pale beneath the grime, eyes narrowed against the glare of the snow. There was no sun, only a bright haze that reflected off the ground and made the air itself seem cold. They moved slowly, as men do when conserving their strength. Breakfast was a scrap of bread softened in melted snow, chewed in silence. The supply runner had not come that morning, perhaps delayed, perhaps worse, and both men knew the food would have to stretch. Hunger was an old companion now, quieter than the cold, but no less persistent. By mid-morning, Evans noticed a new shape near the far fence post, a dark mound that hadn't been there before. He stared at it, trying to decide if it was snow-piled oddly, or something more. Harris followed his gaze, and studied it for a long time. Could be debris, he said at last, but neither of them turned away for long. Every so often, the wind would shift, and the forest would reveal a faint sound, a creak, a thud, the soft crush of snow under weight. Each time, they froze, eyes fixed on the tree line, but nothing emerged. In the early afternoon, a group of 3 soldiers trudged past behind their line, heading toward another position. Their uniforms were stiff with frost, their movements slow and deliberate. One nodded at Evans as they passed, but no words were exchanged. In Bastogne, speech was a luxury. Silence was survival. The hours stretched thin, the cold working deeper. Evans tried flexing his toes in his boots, but they responded sluggishly, the numbness creeping higher with each passing day. He thought of home in short flashes, a hand on his shoulder, a door closing against the wind, the hum of a stove. But the images felt distant, almost like they belonged to someone else. As dusk approached, Harris began reinforcing their cover again, packing the snow tighter, adjusting the angle of his rifle. "They're restless," he said quietly. "Last night wasn't enough for them." Evans nodded, feeling the weight of the words. The forest seemed to agree. As the light faded, it grew still in a way that spoke of attention, as if the trees themselves were listening. By nightfall, the haze had thickened, and the dark came quickly, swallowing the last hints of blue in the sky. Evans settled into his post, his body already aching from the posture he would hold for hours. The cold pressed in from every side, a living thing, testing for weakness. Somewhere far off, a single shot rang out, sharp, clean, and alone. Harris didn't move, didn't blink. "They're marking us," he murmured, counting the holes. The words hung in the frozen air as they listened, waiting for whatever would follow. The single shot from earlier still lingered in Evans's mind as the night deepened. It had not been followed by the usual probing bursts. No mortar shells. No second wave. Just silence that settled over the forest like a held breath. The snow had slowed, falling now in sparse flakes that twisted lazily in the wind. Evans shifted slightly, the stiffness in his knees threatening to cramp if he stayed too still. Harris hadn't moved in what felt like an hour, his silhouette a frozen shape against the low wall of the Foxhole. Then, faintly, there came a sound. Not ahead, but somewhere far to the right. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakable. Boots on snow. The steps were too far apart for a patrol. These were men moving in staggered intervals, careful to keep space between them. Evans and Harris exchanged a glance, the kind that needed no words. They leaned forward, listening, counting the beats between steps. The sound faded, swallowed by distance, only to reappear closer a few minutes later. Somewhere, a branch snapped. A brittle, high-pitched crack that carried through the still air. Harris's hands tightened on his rifle. They waited, breath misting in the cold. For a long time, nothing happened. Then came the whisper of movement again, but this time it was behind them, deeper in the woods. The realization sent a ripple through Evans's chest. They weren't just in front. They were circling. No orders came down the line, no flare lit the night. Each man along the perimeter was left to his own judgment. Harris shifted slightly, the faint crunch of snow under his boot masked by the wind. "They're mapping us," he said quietly, "seeing where we wake up and where we don't." The hours dragged on in this uneasy dance. Footsteps in the distance, a pause, the faint rustle of something moving between the trees, and then nothing. Each time the silence returned, it felt heavier, as if the night was leaning in closer. Sometime after 2 in the morning, the sound changed. It wasn't subtle now. It was the steady crunch of multiple pairs of boots approaching in unison, no longer bothering to hide. Evans felt his pulse quicken, the rifle steady in his hands. Harris raised a hand, signaling to hold fire until the first muzzle flash. The shapes emerged slowly from the black, blurred outlines, darker than the night around them. Evans could feel the air tighten. hear the faint hiss of snow falling from the branches above. Then, a burst of gunfire tore through the silence, coming from further down the line. The figures ahead of them dropped low and scattered back into the trees, their outlines vanishing like smoke. Harris exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon just an inch. "Not tonight," he muttered, but his eyes stayed on the tree line. The rest of the night passed in tense stillness, broken only by the occasional groan of the forest and the distant rumble of artillery elsewhere. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Evans realized he'd barely blinked in hours. The world around them looked unchanged, same snow, same trees, same dead air, but something in the silence felt different now. The enemy had been closer. They'd tasted the edges of their line, and sooner or later, they would try again. The morning began with a sky the color of lead, heavy and low, pressing the light flat against the snow. Evans sat with his back against the frozen wall of the foxhole, rubbing his hands together for warmth that never seemed to come. Harris was quiet, chewing on a piece of jerky so tough it looked more like a strip of leather. There was no runner again today, no new orders, just the same silent expectation that they would hold their ground. The snow around their position was churned and uneven now, marked by days of boots, knees, and the occasional scramble for cover. In the distance, the forest stood in still rows, unmoving, as if carved from stone. Mid-morning brought the first real sound. Distant engines, low and heavy, their vibrations faint but constant. They were too far to see, and the snow seemed to swallow the noise almost as soon as it reached them. Harris tilted his head, listening. "Tanks," he said simply. Evans nodded. It didn't matter if they were moving toward or away from them. The sound was a reminder that the enemy was not idle. Around noon, the wind shifted and carried with it the sharp smell of burning fuel. It prickled at Evans's memory, recalling nights in training when they'd been told how to read a battlefield by scent alone. This was fresh, not the lingering ghost of yesterday's fight. Harris noticed it too, glancing toward the far tree line, as though the smell itself might take shape there. By afternoon, a light snow had begun to fall again, coating everything in a fresh, clean layer that disguised the churned mess beneath. Evans knew it wouldn't last. By nightfall it would be trampled and scarred again. As the day wore on, the cold began to sink deeper, reaching that point where it no longer stung but dulled everything it touched. He could feel it slowing his thoughts, making the hours stretch into a haze. Harris spent the daylight reinforcing their position once more, wedging frozen clumps of earth into the gaps, arranging their ammunition within easy reach. "They'll test us harder tonight," he said, not looking up from his work. The light began to fade early, the horizon dissolving into a flat band of blue-gray. Evans tightened his scarf and adjusted his helmet, settling in for another long vigil. The forest shifted with the darkness. Sound seemed sharper, closer, and the wind took on a tone that felt almost like a whisper. They waited. Minutes slid into hours, the silence pressing on them until Evans found himself straining to hear something, anything. It came at last, not as gunfire, but as a faint metallic clink, like a piece of gear brushing against a weapon. Harris's eyes met his, and in that moment they both knew. The first burst of fire came from the far left, sharp and sudden, lighting the trees for an instant. Then it was answered from the right, and the night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes winked through the forest, brief and blinding in the dark. Evans fired, the recoil jolting through his numb arms, the cold air ripping at his lungs. Harris moved beside him with mechanical precision, each shot deliberate. Somewhere ahead, voices shouted in German, their words carried clearly by the frozen air. The fight surged for several long minutes before ebbing just as quickly. The forest swallowed the echoes, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint hiss of falling snow. Harris didn't lower his weapon. "That wasn't the push," he said quietly. "That was just the knock on the door." The hours after the skirmish felt longer than the fight itself. The night had a way of stretching, as though time moved differently in the dark. Evans sat with his back against the cold wall, his rifle still balanced across his knees, eyes fixed on the tree line. Harris hadn't spoken since the last shot, but his posture told Evans he was still listening for the faintest hint of movement. The snow had nearly stopped now, leaving only a few stray flakes drifting down through the black branches overhead. Somewhere to the left, a man coughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to echo far too loudly in the stillness. Evans glanced in that direction, though the source was invisible in the gloom. The cold gnawed at his legs, working its way upward in slow, persistent waves. Every so often, he would shift his feet inside his boots, trying to coax blood into numb toes. The effort felt pointless, but it was something to do. Midnight came without warning, announced only by the faint rumble of artillery far off to the north. The sound rolled over the forest like distant thunder, lingering in the air before fading away. Evans found himself counting the seconds between the thumps, a habit picked up from other soldiers along the line. Something about tracking the tempo of the fight elsewhere. Harris finally broke the silence. "They'll come again before morning. That last one was to see how fast we'd answer." Evans nodded. He'd felt it too. The sense that the enemy had been just out of reach, gauging their reactions, noting where the defense flared strongest, and where it hesitated. Another hour passed, the darkness pressing heavier with each minute. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost swallowed by the wind, but there, a slow, steady crunch of boots on snow. Evans's pulse quickened, but he stayed still, rifle ready. The steps were methodical, deliberate, closing the distance one careful pace at a time. Harris's breathing slowed, his finger resting lightly near the trigger. The shapes appeared suddenly, darker than the night behind them, moving low along the ground. There were no shouts this time, no bursts of wildfire, just the sharp, controlled crack of rifles. Evans returned fire, his shots steady and measured, each one aimed at a flicker of movement. Muzzle flashes blinked like stars between the trees, here and gone in an instant. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the firing stopped. The forest went still again, the silence now layered with the knowledge that the enemy had been close enough to touch. Evans exhaled slowly, the air clouding around his face. Harris kept his gaze on the tree line for a long time before speaking. "They're tightening the noose," he said. "Every night, a little closer, they're waiting for us to break." The words hung between them, unchallenged, because both men knew they were true. Dawn crept in reluctantly, bringing no warmth and little light. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray, and the snow reflected it back in a dull glow that made everything look frozen in time. Evans sat hunched in the foxhole, watching the day unfold, with the slow detachment of someone who had seen too many mornings that looked exactly the same. Harris moved stiffly, brushing a crust of ice from his helmet, his breath puffing into the still air. There was no runner again, no word from command, no news from the rest of the line. The isolation pressed in, heavy and familiar. Breakfast was a scrap of hard biscuit shared between them, the edges softened only slightly by melting it in their mouths. It wasn't enough to fill them, but hunger had long ago stopped being sharp. It was now a dull ache that sat alongside the cold and fatigue, all of them constant companions. The day was unnervingly quiet, no distant gunfire, no far-off artillery, just the occasional creak of the forest settling under its weight of snow. Evans and Harris took turns scanning the tree line, their eyes drawn again and again to the same landmarks. The crooked fence post, the dark scar of an old crater, the lean of a dead tree. Any change could mean movement, and they knew the Germans were patient enough to let boredom soften a man's attention. In the early afternoon, a light snow began to fall, tiny flakes drifting lazily through the air, muffling the world even further. The sound of boots crunching on snow would be harder to hear in this softness, and that thought kept Evans on edge. He found himself staring into the trees until the shapes began to shift in his mind, turning into imagined figures that vanished when he blinked. Harris noticed. "Don't chase ghosts," he said quietly, not looking up from his post. "They'll come when they want to, not when you think you see them." The words were steady, but Evans heard the fatigue beneath them. As the light began to fade, the forest seemed to lean closer, the gaps between the trees narrowing in the gloom. They made their preparations without speaking, checking ammunition, reinforcing the low wall of frozen earth, adjusting their gear for the long hours ahead. By nightfall, the snow was falling harder, and the darkness came quickly, wrapping the forest in a thick, soundless shroud. They settled into their positions, eyes fixed on the black horizon. Hours passed, marked only by the slow ache of cold in their fingers and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Then, faintly, came a sound, a low, deliberate scrape, like a boot sliding on ice. Harris froze, his gaze sharpening. Another sound followed, closer this time, then another, until Evans could feel the pattern in his chest. The figures appeared as darker shapes within the dark, moving with practiced care. Harris didn't wait for the first shot this time. He fired once, clean and sharp. The shapes scattered, and the night erupted in short bursts of fire. Evans joined in, aiming at the brief flashes between the trees. The fight lasted only minutes, but when it ended, the silence felt heavier than before. Harris exhaled and said, "They're not testing anymore. They're measuring how much we have left." Evans said nothing. He knew Harris was right. The morning after the brief firefight carried with it an odd stillness, the kind that made every sound seem sharper. Evans woke with a start, his shoulders stiff from sleeping half upright against the frozen wall of the foxhole. Harris was already awake, crouched low, his eyes scanning the tree line with the same patient focus he'd kept for days. The snow had stopped falling sometime in the night, leaving a thin crust over everything. Each step now would make a crisp, brittle sound, impossible to mask. Their breath rose in steady clouds, vanishing into the pale air. There was still no word from the other positions, though Evans could hear the occasional faint clink of metal or muffled cough somewhere along the line. It was enough to remind him they weren't alone, even if each hole felt like its own small world. Breakfast was non-existent. They'd eaten the last of the biscuits the day before, and the runner with resupply hadn't come in 3 days. Hunger was now a hollow space inside him, dull but constant, like the ache in his joints. Harris didn't complain, but Evans could see in the set of his jaw that the lack of food was wearing him down. Mid-morning brought movement, not in the trees ahead, but to their left. A pair of soldiers emerged from the white haze, their uniforms stiff with frost. One carried a small satchel, the other a rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. They stopped briefly at the edge of the foxhole, sharing a quick nod. "Scouts," Harris murmured. The two men vanished into the trees within moments, their figures blending into the pale trunks and shadows until they were gone. Evans returned his focus to the same landmarks he had memorized: the leaning oak, the half-buried fence post, the mound of snow that might have been debris or something else. By early afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made both men tense. It was distant but steady, the rhythmic grind of treads over frozen ground. Tanks again, or perhaps half-tracks. They couldn't tell if the noise was approaching or circling, but it was close enough to feel in the chest. Harris's gaze never left the tree line. "They're getting ready," he said. The words were low, but certain. As daylight faded, the forest took on its familiar evening stillness, the kind that felt like it was listening. They checked their weapons, fingers numb against cold metal, and settled in for the night. Hours passed without incident. Evans began to think the day's quiet might last, until a sudden burst of gunfire erupted far down the line. The sound rolled through the trees, followed by a flare that lit the sky in pale green. In that light, just for a moment, Evans thought he saw figures moving at the far edge of the field. Too far to be certain, but enough to set his pulse hammering. The flare died, and darkness reclaimed the forest. Harris's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're watching how we wake up." And so they waited, not knowing if the next burst would come in minutes or hours, their eyes fixed on the black space between the trees. The cold that night was the kind that seemed to get inside a man's bones and stay there. Evans could feel it in his teeth when he breathed, in his fingertips when he tried to adjust his grip on the rifle. The forest lay ahead, black and unmoving, but it had the heavy, watchful quality of something alive. Harris sat motionless beside him, his breath slow, the rim of his helmet catching the faintest glint of starlight. The hours crept forward without a sound, except for the faint hiss of frost shifting on the branches above. Evans counted in his head to stay awake, listening for anything that didn't belong. Once he thought he heard the faint crunch of snow in the distance, but it could have been his own heartbeat in his ears. The hunger was sharper tonight. Without rations for 4 days, his stomach had become a hollow drum, the aches spreading into his back and shoulders. Harris didn't speak, but Evans could tell by his stillness that the cold and hunger were pressing on him too. Just after midnight, a low thump rolled through the forest. Artillery, but not close. The sound came again, steady but far enough that it felt more like a reminder than a threat. Evans thought of the men on the other end of those shells, shivering in their own holes, listening to the same night. The wind shifted briefly, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that made his skin prickle. Harris noticed it too. "Gear oil," he whispered. It was a scent both of them recognized from training. Freshly maintained weapons, close enough for the wind to carry. The forest ahead was still black, but Evans could feel it, the same way a man feels the air change before a storm. They stayed perfectly still, waiting. Minutes dragged into an hour. The smell came and went with the breeze, always faint, always there. Around 3 in the morning, the sound of boots finally broke the silence. Slow, deliberate, too spaced to be a charge. Harris raised his rifle, and Evans followed. The shapes appeared briefly, moving low, just at the edge of sight. Harris didn't fire, and neither did Evans. They watched as the figures slipped back into the dark, the snow swallowing their sound. "Recon," Harris said quietly, counting heads. The rest of the night passed without a shot, but neither man relaxed. The forest had leaned close, taken its measure, and pulled away again. By the time the sky began to pale, Evans felt as though they'd been holding their breath for hours. The light brought no comfort, only the knowledge that the night's work was done, and that the next would likely come sooner than they were ready for. Dawn broke without ceremony, a dim gray light spreading slowly over the frozen landscape. The snow glowed faintly in the early haze, but it did nothing to warm the air. Evans shifted his weight, stretching his legs as much as the narrow space of the foxhole allowed. Harris was sipping melted snow from his canteen, the water so cold it made his breath catch. They hadn't spoken much since the night before, but that was common now. Words seemed to cost too much energy. The air carried a brittle stillness that morning, the kind that made even the smallest sound feel out of place. Somewhere far off, a single shot cracked, but it didn't repeat. It was likely an accident, or a hunter's rifle, though in Bastogne, assumptions like that could be dangerous. Their rations were gone, and the gnawing emptiness inside them was now as much a part of the day as the frost on their helmets. Harris found a single square of chocolate in his pack, half melted, refrozen, and wrapped in paper, worn soft from handling. He broke it evenly, handing one piece to Evans without a word. The taste was bitter, but it was something solid, something that wasn't snow. Mid-morning brought movement behind the line, a group of weary medics trudging past, their stretchers empty, but their faces drawn. One gave a brief nod in greeting, none slowed their pace. Evans watched them disappear into the haze, and wondered if they would come back the same way. By midday, the light was brighter but still cold, the sky, a washed-out white. The landmarks in front of them, the leaning oak, the fence post, the crater, stood unchanged. but Evans kept scanning for any shift in shadow, any flicker of movement that didn't belong. The monotony was its own kind of weapon, wearing away at focus, making it harder to tell real from imagined. In the late afternoon the wind picked up, and with it came a low rumble, steady, mechanical and too distant to place. Harris set his jaw listening. "They're not far," he said. Evans nodded, though the sound soon faded, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind. As darkness fell, the forest ahead became a wall of black. They made their preparations as always, checking ammunition, reinforcing the frozen walls, tucking in gear so it wouldn't clink in the night. Hours passed in silence, the kind that made every breath feel loud. Just after midnight, a faint glimmer appeared between the trees, a flicker of light, gone before either man could place it. Then came the sound. Boots in snow. Faint but steady, moving in pairs. Evans felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the rush of alertness through his fatigue. The shapes appeared briefly, darker than the night around them, then melted back into the forest. No shots were fired, but the message was clear. They were being watched, measured, and remembered. When dawn finally arrived, Evans felt older than he had the day before, as though each night in Bastogne added more weight than a month anywhere else. The morning began with a thin veil of mist that blurred the tree line into a pale smudge against the sky. Evans sat hunched forward, his blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders, though the cold still found every gap. Harris was quiet, his breath slow and measured, eyes scanning the horizon with the same unbroken patience he'd carried since the first night. The mist clung to the ground, muting sound, making the world feel smaller and closer. It wasn't a welcome kind of stillness, it was the sort that felt like it was hiding something. The Foxhole smelled of damp earth and metal, a scent Evans now associated with every waking moment. Their hands were clumsy from the cold, fingers stiff as they checked weapons and shifted gear into easy reach. Neither man spoke of food. There had been none for 2 days, and hunger was now so constant it was almost invisible. Around mid-morning a faint rumble drifted through the mist. It was too muffled to place. Vehicles, perhaps, or heavy artillery moving somewhere beyond the trees. The sound came and went, swallowed by the air, but it left a tension behind, the kind that made every muscle stay half-ready. The landmarks they watched daily were harder to see now, the leaning oak just a faint shadow in the white, the fence post nearly invisible. This made scanning more difficult, and Evans found himself leaning forward, narrowing his eyes to pick out shapes. The mist began to thin in the early afternoon, and with it came a faint shift in the wind. It carried a smell, wood smoke, faint but fresh. Harris noticed it instantly. "Close," he murmured. They watched, but the tree line stayed empty, the snow untouched. The hours dragged forward toward evening, each one colder than the last. As the light drained from the sky, the mist returned, thicker now, curling through the trees and over the snow like pale smoke. They set their positions for the night, movement slow, but deliberate. Evans felt his eyes grow heavy, the cold numbing more than just his hands and feet, but the sound brought him back. Soft, deliberate crunches in the snow, from more than one set of boots. The mist made it impossible to judge distance. Harris leaned forward, peering into the white. Then, a faint metallic click broke the hush. Evans knew the sound. A rifle bolt being eased forward. Harris didn't hesitate. His first shot was sharp and clean, disappearing into the fog. A reply came instantly, the flash hidden, but the sound unmistakable. For a brief, tense minute, shots traded across the unseen space between them, the figures nothing more than ghosts in the mist. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the night swallowed it again. The fog held still, and the only sound was the faint hiss of frost settling. Evans stayed awake until the first hint of dawn, eyes fixed on the pale curtain ahead, knowing whatever had come close had not gone far. The dawn after the fog fight came slow and reluctant, as if the light itself was hesitant to return. The mist thinned but didn't vanish entirely, drifting in pale ribbons through the trees. Evans sat with his knees drawn up, the rifle resting across them, feeling the cold deep in his joints. Harris was already awake, though it was hard to tell if he'd ever really slept. His eyes were fixed on the same patch of tree line they'd been watching for hours, scanning for movement. The snow looked untouched, smooth and white, but Evans knew better. Footprints could be buried in minutes here. They didn't speak much. The silence was safer, and it saved energy. Breakfast was nothing, and hunger gnawed more sharply now, making his hands tremble when he tried to adjust his gear. The wind was light but steady, carrying with it a faint smell of fuel. That meant machines nearby, perhaps warming their engines, perhaps moving into position. Harris noticed too. Evans could see the slight narrowing of his eyes. Mid-morning passed without incident, the hours stretching long in the pale light. Occasionally a faint metallic sound would drift from the woods, far enough to be uncertain but close enough to keep them tense. By afternoon, the mist had almost cleared, revealing their familiar landmarks. The leaning oak stood stark against the white, and the crooked fence post cast a thin shadow across the snow. Evans stared at them until the shapes blurred, his mind playing tricks. Harris gave a low warning, "Don't let it drift," and Evans blinked hard, pulling himself back. As evening approached, the temperature dropped fast. The cold bit into any exposed skin, and even their breath seemed to freeze in the air. They went through the familiar ritual of reinforcing the foxhole walls, checking ammunition, and positioning their rifles within easy reach. Darkness came early, the last of the light bleeding out behind the trees. The first sound of the night was faint, soft shuffling, like cloth brushing against wood. Then came the crunch of snow, not hurried, but steady, approaching from the right. Harris angled toward it, eyes locked on the shadows. Evans followed the sound with his breathing slow and shallow. A flicker of movement appeared, low, quick, and gone again. Harris didn't fire, and neither did Evans. Minutes passed, the silence stretching taut. Then, from further ahead, a short burst of fire erupted, sharp and precise. Evans's rifle came up instinctively, but the shapes ahead were already melting back into the dark. The exchange had been brief. Testing, not taking. When it was over, the forest felt heavier than before, as though the ground itself had been listening. Harris stayed alert long after, his voice finally breaking the quiet. "They're marking their path," he said. "Next time they'll come faster." Evans said nothing. He simply kept his eyes on the tree line, waiting for the next sound to break the night. Morning came with a brittle cold that seemed sharper than any day before. The air felt dry enough to crack, and every breath stung in Evans's chest. The forest was motionless, the snow unbroken, but the quiet carried a weight that made both men uneasy. Harris moved with slow precision, brushing frost from the lip of the foxhole, before settling into his usual watch position. Evans followed his gaze to the landmarks they both knew so well, the leaning oak, the crooked fence post, the crater. All was still there, unchanged, but each felt like it was waiting. No runner arrived again, and neither man mentioned food. It had been days without rations now, and their bodies were adapting in unpleasant ways, hands shaking, movements slower, thoughts harder to hold. Hunger had stopped feeling sharp. Now it was a dull, grinding emptiness that seemed to fill every corner inside. The sky stayed overcast through the morning, casting a flat gray light over the snow. Every sound stood out against the stillness. A distant woodpecker hammered somewhere unseen. A branch snapped far off, sharp as a rifle crack, but followed by nothing. Harris shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Could be nothing," he murmured, though Evans knew he didn't believe it. Midday brought a change in the wind, and with it came a faint murmur. Low voices, impossible to make out, drifting just above the edge of hearing. Both men froze, straining to catch the direction. The voices faded, then returned, now a little clearer, though still distorted by the cold air. Harris made a small gesture to stay down. Minutes passed. The snow remained untouched, the tree line still. Then, without warning, a short burst of automatic fire erupted far to their left. The sound rolled through the trees, followed by a few answering shots, then silence again. Evan's hands tightened on his rifle. The quiet that followed felt even heavier. As the afternoon waned, the sky darkened earlier than usual, a sign of thicker clouds building overhead. They prepared for another night, checking ammunition, adjusting the frozen walls, settling into positions they knew they wouldn't move from for hours. The first sound came just after full dark, the unmistakable clink of metal on metal, close enough that Evans felt it in his chest. Harris's head turned slightly toward it, his breath visible in the cold air. Another sound followed, softer, a slow, deliberate step in the snow. Evans peered into the black, catching only the faintest suggestion of movement before it vanished. Then the forest went still. Minutes stretched into an hour without another sound. The waiting was its own kind of battle, one fought with nerves instead of bullets. When a single rifle cracked somewhere far off, neither man reacted beyond the bare tightening of their grips. The shot was too distant to matter, but close enough to remind them that the line was never fully quiet. Harris finally spoke near dawn, his voice flat. "They'll keep this up until we're tired enough to miss one sound. That's when they'll come." Evans said nothing, but he knew it was true. The morning was little more than a faint lightening of the gray sky, a change so subtle it was hard to notice unless you'd been staring at the same horizon for hours. Evans rubbed at his eyes, trying to work some warmth into his stiff fingers. Harris was already on watch, his gaze fixed and steady, scanning the tree line for any detail out of place. The snow lay smooth again, covering whatever signs the night might have left behind. There was no sound except the faint creak of trees shifting under their icy load. No runner came, no word from the other positions, no food. Evans's stomach had stopped protesting days ago. Now it just felt like a hollow, cold space that drained his strength. The wind was light, but it carried scents that didn't belong. The faint, oily tang of machine grease, the acrid ghost of old smoke. Harris caught it too. "Close," he said quietly. They both knew the wind carried truth. Hours passed with nothing more than the occasional whisper of snow sliding from a branch. Evans's eyes kept drifting to the same landmarks, the leaning oak, the crater, the fence post. They were constants in a place where almost everything else felt unpredictable. But sometimes, constants could hide change. In the mid-afternoon, Evans noticed it. The mound of snow near the crater seemed taller than before, a subtle swell that hadn't been there that morning. He said nothing at first, watching it for nearly an hour. It didn't move, but his unease grew. As daylight began to fade, Harris noticed too. "Could be nothing," he murmured, but his tone suggested otherwise. They made their usual preparations for the night, each movement deliberate and quiet. Ammunition was set within reach, weapons checked twice, the frozen walls reinforced. The cold deepened quickly, and with it came the familiar stillness that always preceded movement. It began just after full dark, a faint, steady sound, like fabric brushing against bark. Then came the crunch of snow, slow and cautious. Evans held his breath, eyes fixed on the tree line. A shape appeared, darker than the space around it, pausing between two trees. Another followed, slightly to the right. Harris didn't fire. He was waiting for a clearer shot. The figures stayed low, moving with deliberate precision, and then melted back into the black. The forest held its breath. For the next 2 hours, the sounds came and went. Steps, pauses, faint clicks of metal. Each time Evans thought they were gone, another small noise would surface, reminding him they were still there. No shots were fired on either side. By the time the sky began to pale, Evans felt as if he'd been sitting in the same position for days. Harris's voice broke the silence at last. "They're feeling for a gap," he said, "and sooner or later they'll find one." The pale light of morning revealed nothing new. No fresh tracks, no debris, no visible signs of what had moved in the dark. The snow had covered its own story again, smoothing over the evidence, until the night might as well have been a dream. Evans sat low in the foxhole, his shoulders hunched, rubbing his hands together in a slow rhythm to keep his fingers from going numb. Harris leaned against the frozen wall, eyes narrowed at the tree line. The silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that hummed just beneath the skin, making every sound seem sharper. There was still no sign of a runner, and food was a memory that grew fainter with each passing day. The hunger had shifted into a constant weakness now, a heaviness in the limbs that made movement sluggish. Around mid-morning, a sound broke the quiet, not in front of them, but behind. Distant, muffled voices, carrying over the snow from deeper inside their own lines. Evans recognized the tone, orders being passed, short and clipped. Something was moving in the rear. A few minutes later, a small group appeared along the trench path behind the foxhole. 3 men in heavy coats, one carrying a radio set on his back. They didn't stop to talk, only nodded once before disappearing into the next position. Harris watched them go, his jaw tight. "They're bracing," he said quietly. "Something's coming." The rest of the day passed with that thought hanging over them. The wind picked up in the early afternoon, carrying scents that didn't belong. Burnt fuel, hot metal, the faint sulfur tang of spent powder. None of it was strong, but all of it was fresh. The tree line stayed still, but Evans's eyes kept catching on places where the shadows looked wrong. Once he thought he saw movement near the leaning oak, but it vanished before he could be sure. As the light faded, both men prepared for the night with the same quiet efficiency. Rifles checked, ammunition laid out, walls reinforced. Darkness closed in quickly under heavy clouds, leaving no stars, no moon, only blackness. It started not with a shot, but with a sound, low, mechanical and steady. An engine, then another. Evans and Harris exchanged a glance, both leaning forward to listen. The noise grew, coming from deep within the forest ahead. It stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete, it made Evans's ears strain for the smallest noise. Then the first shot cracked, sharp and close. A burst of automatic fire followed from the left, answered by more from the right. The night erupted into chaos. Short, fierce exchanges of gunfire flickering like lightning in the dark. Figures moved between the trees, just shapes against black, darting forward and vanishing again. Evans fired at the flashes, his rifle bucking in his hands, the smell of powder hot in the frozen air. The fight surged and ebbed, never fully breaking into a charge, but never letting the line rest. After what felt like hours, the forest went still again. Harris exhaled slowly, his breath white in the cold. "That," he said, "wasn't all they brought." The morning after the attack was dim and windless, the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin but seemed to reach directly into the bones. The forest ahead looked as still as it always did, but Evans felt the difference in the air. It was heavier, like the hours after a storm that hadn't quite finished. Harris crouched at the edge of the foxhole, scanning the tree line with a steady, unblinking gaze. Neither man spoke about the fight from the night before. There was nothing to analyze. Both knew it had only been a piece of what was coming. No runner arrived again, and the absence was starting to feel deliberate. The hunger was past the point of gnawing. Now it was a weight, pulling on their muscles and slowing their thoughts. Even small movements felt deliberate and slow, as if every action had to be approved by some hidden reserve of energy. Mid-morning brought a faint, distant noise, metal clinking against metal. Evans stilled, his head tilting toward the sound. It came again, clearer this time, and Harris's eyes narrowed. It wasn't the random noise of gear shifting, it was measured, purposeful. Then it stopped. They kept listening for it, but the only thing that followed was the occasional groan of branches under snow. By early afternoon the wind began to change, blowing cold air from the direction of the tree line. The scent that came with it was sharp and wrong. Burnt oil, and the faint bitterness of explosives. Harris shifted his position but didn't speak. The clouds thickened overhead, dimming the already pale light. Shadows lengthened quickly, and the forest darkened in that way that always felt too fast, as if night were impatient to begin. They went through their evening preparations. Rifles checked, ammunition ready, gear tightened so nothing would rattle in the dark. The first sound came earlier than usual. A low, rhythmic crunch of boots on snow, unhurried but steady. Evans's hands tightened around his weapon. The shapes appeared soon after, emerging from the black space between the trees, low and deliberate. This time there was no pause for observation. The first shots cracked almost immediately, and the night lit with flashes from both sides. Evans fired, the recoil biting into his shoulder, the air filling with the sharp tang of gunpowder. Harris moved with the same calm precision as always, each shot measured. But the enemy didn't retreat as quickly this time. They lingered, shifting positions, forcing the defenders to move their aim again and again. After long minutes the firing slowed, then stopped entirely. The darkness closed in once more, silent except for the faint hiss of snow. Harris stayed crouched, scanning for any sign of return. "They're pressing closer," he said finally. "When they push next it won't be to test." Evans kept his rifle ready, knowing Harris was right. The forest ahead had stopped feeling like distance. It was now just a wall they both knew would break. Dawn came flat and colorless, the kind of light that seemed to erase shadows rather than cast them. The snow was smooth again, covering whatever scars the night's fight had left behind. Evans sat hunched in the foxhole, pulling his blanket tighter, though it had long since stopped keeping him warm. Harris was crouched at the rim, his eyes locked on the tree line, as if willing it to reveal its secrets. No movement, no sound, just the heavy stillness that Bastogne mornings seemed to carry. There was no runner, no food. The ache of hunger had turned into a constant fog in Evans's head, slowing thoughts and blurring focus. His hands trembled when he adjusted his rifle, not from fear but from exhaustion. Mid-morning passed with nothing more than the occasional creak of the forest under its weight of snow. The wind shifted near noon, carrying with it a faint scent. Smoke, but not wood smoke. It was sharper, mixed with the metallic tang of fuel. Harris noticed it too. "They're staging," he said quietly. Evans didn't need convincing. The air had a way of telling the truth here, and the truth was that something was building beyond those trees. In the early afternoon, a sound joined the air. The low grind of treads, distant but steady. Tanks, or something heavier than trucks. The noise rose and fell with the terrain, sometimes fading almost to silence before swelling again. Harris listened for a long time, then muttered, "Not a patrol. That's movement with weight behind it." The light began to fail earlier than usual, as if the day itself wanted to be done. They prepared without speaking, checking ammunition, packing the wall tighter, shifting gear into easy reach. The wind grew sharper, carrying flecks of ice that stung against exposed skin. The first sign came just after full dark, a flare in the distance, its pale green light spilling over the treetops. For a moment, everything was visible. The white field, the leaning oak, the fence post, and beyond them, faint shapes moving in low formation. The flare died, plunging the world back into black. Seconds later, gunfire erupted from far to the left. A short burst answered by another further down the line. Then came the closer sounds. Boots in snow, the snap of branches, the muted clicks of weapons being readied. Harris raised his rifle, sighting toward a shadow that shifted between two trees. Evans followed, catching a flicker of movement before the first muzzle flash lit the dark. The fight that followed was sharp and fast, the enemy pushing close enough for Evans to catch glimpses of helmets and outlines. Each shot was a careful choice, There was no wasting ammunition now. After what felt like an hour but could only have been minutes, the firing tapered off. The sounds faded, leaving the night still again. Harris stayed ready, his voice low. "They'll hit harder next time. This was just the edge of it." Evans nodded, his eyes never leaving the tree line. Somewhere out there, the real push was waiting. The morning after the flare attack felt heavier, as though the air itself had absorbed some of the night's tension and refused to let it go. The sky was a flat, unbroken gray, pressing down on the forest and the field in front of them. Evans sat low in the foxhole, his knees pulled tight to his chest, the rifle balanced across them. Harris stood for a time at the rim, scanning the tree line through the pale haze. No footprints were visible. The night snow had buried everything again. But they both knew that just beyond sight, the enemy had not gone far. No runner came, no food. Evans's head felt thick, his thoughts slow, every movement deliberate, because haste wasted energy they no longer had. Around mid-morning, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint rhythmic noise, metal on metal, clinking in a way that spoke of weapons being handled, not tools. It came in short bursts, stopping for long stretches, as if whoever was making it didn't want it heard. Harris's eyes narrowed. They're out there, and they're patient. The hours slid by, each one colder than the last. The landmarks they'd memorized stood unchanged, the leaning oak, the fence post, the crater. But Evans couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those familiar shapes, something had shifted. He kept his focus locked forward, blinking against the dry sting in his eyes. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, bringing with it a new scent. Burning fuel, thick and acrid, mixed with the faint bite of explosives. Harris didn't comment, but Evans saw him adjust his position, moving slower now, deliberate. As darkness closed in, the temperature dropped sharply. The forest ahead seemed to shrink, the black shapes of the trees pulling closer together, as though to hide whatever was behind them. They made their preparations, ammunition laid out, rifles checked twice, walls reinforced. The first sign of the night's movement came earlier than expected. A low hum, mechanical, deep enough to feel in the ribs. Evans froze, listening. It grew steadily louder, then stopped. The silence that followed was the kind that felt unnatural, like the pause before a match is struck. Then came the first flash, bright and sudden, far down the line to their left. The sound followed an instant later, gunfire sharp in the cold air. Another flash appeared ahead, closer, and Harris fired without hesitation. Evans joined in, aiming for the bursts of light between the trees. The fight was quick but fierce, the enemy pushing closer, before melting back into the dark. Even after the shooting stopped, the forest felt alive, restless. Harris kept his rifle up, scanning the tree line. "They're closing the gap," he said quietly, "and when it's gone, it'll be all at once." Evans nodded, his hands tight on the weapon, knowing the gap might already be smaller than they realized. The next morning brought no relief. Only a colder wind that swept across the field in front of them, and rattled the bare branches at the edge of the forest. The light was thin and metallic, giving the snow a dull sheen rather than a brightness. Evans sat with his back to the frozen wall of the foxhole, hands buried deep in his pockets, feeling the slow pulse of cold in his fingertips. Harris stood briefly to scan the tree line, then crouched again, his expression unreadable. The night snow had smoothed the ground to a blank canvas, but Evans couldn't shake the thought that every inch of it had been measured and marked by eyes they couldn't see. The hunger was worse now, a constant fog that dulled his senses and made every sound harder to place. His stomach no longer growled, it just ached, deep and steady, like an old injury. Mid-morning brought the first sound, a faint, distant thump that might have been artillery far off, though too muffled to be sure. Then another, closer this time, followed by silence. Harris tilted his head, listening for a pattern, but none came. The wind shifted toward midday, and with it came the sharp smell of burning oil, mingled with the faint metallic tang that meant gunfire had been close recently. The tree line stayed still, but the air felt charged, as if holding something back. The hours passed slowly, the light fading early behind thick clouds. By the time they began their nightly preparations, checking ammunition, packing the wall tighter, laying weapons within easy reach, Evans could feel the weight of the coming dark pressing on him. The first sign of movement came just after full night, the crunch of boots on snow, steady but careful. Harris's hand tightened around his rifle, his eyes fixed forward. The sound grew, then stopped abruptly. A few heartbeats later, it started again from a slightly different angle. Evans's breath slowed, the rifle stock cold against his cheek as he searched for a shape in the blackness. A flicker of movement appeared between two trees, then another to the left. The shots came almost together, one from Harris, one from Evans, and the night lit with returning flashes. Muzzle fire winked through the tree line, close enough now for Evans to make out helmets glinting faintly in the dark. The exchange was short but sharp, the enemy pulling back quickly, their boots crunching away into the snow. Silence followed, but it was not an end, just the space between pushes. Harris lowered his rifle only slightly, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "They're walking us toward something," he said. Evans didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the tree line, certain that somewhere in that darkness, the next move was already waiting. The morning after felt like the world had been drained of sound. Even the wind seemed to move cautiously, whispering through the trees rather than rattling them. Evans sat low in the foxhole, shoulders hunched, staring out at the tree line that now felt closer than it had yesterday. Harris was awake but still, his gaze fixed in that patient way of his, scanning from landmark to landmark, the leaning oak, the fence post, the crater. Nothing moved, yet the quiet had a tension to it, like a held breath. No runner came. The thought barely mattered anymore. Food had slipped from being an expectation to a distant idea. Hunger lived with them now, dull but insistent, making every movement cost more than it should. Mid-morning brought a faint sound, metal shifting, faint and far, almost lost in the cold air. It wasn't rhythmic enough to be marching, but it carried intent. Harris caught it, and didn't move for nearly a full minute, his eyes locked ahead, until the sound faded entirely. By early afternoon, the sky had darkened into a flat, oppressive gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. The light felt strange, thin, as if it couldn't quite reach the ground. Evans found himself blinking often, struggling to focus on details without his eyes watering from the cold. They reinforced the foxhole wall before the dark came, working in silence. The ice-crusted dirt clinked against the frozen rim as they packed it tighter. By the time they finished, the air had gone still, the temperature dropping sharply with the fading light. The first sign of trouble came sooner than expected. A faint vibration underfoot. So slight Evans thought at first it was his imagination. But Harris felt it too, pressing one hand to the frozen wall. "Engines," he said quietly. The hum was low, almost swallowed by the cold, but steady. It grew for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence after was almost worse. Then, from the tree line, a flare shot up, bathing the snow in a pale red glow. For several seconds, Evans could see everything: the twisted shapes of the trees, the long shadows of the fence post and oak, and beyond them, dark figures moving low in formation. The light faded, and the blackness returned. A moment later, the first shots cracked through the air. Harris fired immediately, his muzzle flash brief and sharp. Evans joined him, aiming at the glints and flickers between the trees. The exchange was fierce but brief, the enemy pressing forward only to pull back again. The silence that followed was thick, but Evans knew it wouldn't last. Harris kept his rifle ready, his voice low and certain. "They're closing in for the push. Won't be long now." Evans nodded, feeling the truth of it settle like a weight in his chest. The forest was no longer just watching, it was leaning in. The dawn that followed felt thinner than usual, as though the light itself was reluctant to come. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, leaving a fresh, undisturbed sheet across the field in front of them. Evan studied it carefully, knowing any break in that smoothness would mean something had moved. Harris crouched at the rim, scanning with slow precision, his breath curling into the air in short, even clouds. Neither man spoke about the flare or the figures from the night before. There was nothing to say. They both knew what it had meant. No runner arrived. The absence barely registered anymore. Food had become less of a hope and more of a distant memory. Hunger was no longer sharp but heavy, as if it were sitting on his shoulders. The cold was worse today, the kind that made every blink feel slower, every thought just a bit delayed. Around mid-morning, a faint sound broke the stillness, the distant metallic grind of treads. It came in and out, sometimes fading until it was barely there, then swelling again like a far-off wave. Harris listened for a long time before murmuring, "They're shifting into position." The sound lasted nearly an hour before disappearing entirely. Afternoon brought no relief from the tension. The landmarks remained the same, the leaning oak, the fence post, the crater. But Evans's eyes kept playing tricks on him, making shadows look like figures. Harris noticed his shifting focus, and said quietly, "Hold to what you know, not what you think you see." The light began to fail early, clouds hanging low and heavy. They made their preparations without speaking. Rifles checked, ammunition within reach, frozen walls reinforced. The first sign came just after full dark, a low, rolling hum of engines from somewhere deep in the tree line. This time it didn't stop. It grew louder, accompanied by faint voices in short, clipped bursts. Then came the first flare, rising high and burning white. The snow lit up like glass under moonlight, and in that moment, Evans saw them clearly, lines of figures moving low but fast, spreading out across the open ground. Harris's first shot was clean, sharp, and answered instantly. The night erupted, rifle fire, muzzle flashes strobing through the dark, the distinct chatter of an MG somewhere ahead. Evans fired, aimed again, and fired once more, the recoil jarring his shoulder each time. Snow kicked up around the foxhole as bullets found their mark nearby. The fight surged, loud and chaotic, until the flare's light finally died and the darkness swallowed everything again. The firing slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving only the ringing in Evans's ears and the sound of his own breathing. Harris stayed crouched, rifle still ready. "They were testing the charge distance," he said. "Next time they'll run it." Evans knew he was right. The night didn't feel like it was over. It felt like it was just catching its breath. Morning came with a strange brightness, the kind that happens when the sky is thick with cloud, yet the snow reflects every bit of light back into the air. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Evans sat low in the foxhole, watching the white field stretch toward the tree line, knowing it was an empty stage waiting for the next act. Harris was quiet, his breath steady, his eyes fixed forward in the same slow sweep from oak to fence post to crater. The night's fight had left no visible trace. Fresh snow had erased it all, but both men could still feel the echo of it in their bones. No runner appeared, no food. The weight of hunger had dulled their muscles, slowed their movements to the pace of exhaustion. Even lifting the rifle felt heavier than it should have. Around mid-morning the wind carried something new, faint, rhythmic thumps from far off, deep enough to feel in the chest more than hear in the ear. Artillery, maybe moving, maybe firing from a distance. Harris listened for the rhythm, then said quietly, "They're softening somewhere. Could be here next." The sound faded, replaced by the brittle stillness of cold air and snow. Afternoon brought a subtle shift in the forest. The landmarks were still there, but the space between them felt tighter, as though the trees themselves had crept forward a little. Evans caught himself leaning in, searching for details, forcing his eyes to hold focus until they watered from the cold. Harris didn't speak, but Evans could tell from his stillness that he felt it too. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped fast, and the dark seemed to arrive all at once. They prepared in silence, every movement slow and deliberate. Ammunition was set where it could be grabbed without looking. Rifles checked twice, walls packed tighter against the cold. The first sound came earlier than expected. A low, deep hum of engines, steady and without pause. Then came voices, short commands in German, too close now to mistake. Harris's head tilted slightly, his rifle already aimed. A flare shot up from somewhere down the line, casting the snow in pale blue light. In that instant Evans saw them, figures breaking from the tree line, moving quickly and low, spread wide. Harris fired, and Evans followed, the recoil jarring against numb shoulders. The enemy returned fire immediately, muzzle flashes winking like lightning in the dark. Bullets hissed through the snow-packed air, snapping branches and kicking up white plumes around the foxhole. The fight was faster this time, sharper, the enemy pressing harder before melting back into the black. When it ended, the silence felt like a trick. Too still, too complete. Harris didn't lower his weapon. "They're almost ready," he said, his voice calm but certain. "Next time, they won't stop until one side's gone." Evans kept his rifle steady, staring into the tree line, waiting for the darkness to move again. The dawn after the latest push came as nothing more than a dull thickening of the sky. There was no sunrise here, not anymore, just a shift from black to gray that left the world looking exactly as it had the night before. Evans woke to the sound of Harris shifting his weight, the crunch of ice under his boots breaking the heavy stillness. The snow was smooth again across the open field, its blankness deceptive. Evans knew that somewhere under that clean white lay the traces of the night's movements, boot prints, shell impacts, maybe even bodies now buried under the drift. Hunger gnawed at him, in a quiet, steady way. It no longer came in waves, but sat like a weight in his gut. Harris handed him a chunk of snow to melt in his mouth. The cold was shocking, but it dulled the ache of thirst. They said nothing. The quiet between them was not emptiness, but a mutual understanding that words did nothing to change what waited beyond the tree line. Mid-morning brought a new sound, faint at first, like fabric moving across rough wood. It came again closer, joined by a low metallic clink. Harris froze, listening, his eyes narrowing. Evans held his breath. The sounds faded, replaced by the hollow quiet of cold air, but the impression lingered. The enemy was still out there, still moving. By early afternoon, the wind began to carry the scent of burning fuel, stronger now, mingled with the faint, acrid bite of explosives. It was fresh, not the ghost of some distant fight. Harris didn't comment, but Evans saw the subtle tightening of his jaw. The sky darkened early, clouds hanging low and heavy, muting the last of the daylight. They prepared for night the way they always did. Gear tightened, ammunition within arm's reach, weapons checked twice over. The first sign of movement came before full dark, a single flare far to the left, casting a pale white glow over the distant snow. In its light, Evans saw figures moving, not close enough to shoot, but too many to ignore. When the flare died, the blackness returned thicker than before. The hum of engines began soon after, low and steady, accompanied by muffled voices in German. Then the night erupted. Gunfire from the far left sweeping across the line, answered immediately by bursts from the right. Harris fired without hesitation, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the hard set of his expression. Evans joined in, aiming at the brief glints and shadows in the trees. The air filled with the sharp tang of gunpowder and the hiss of snow as bullets tore through it. The fight was fierce and close this time, the enemy pushing farther before slipping back into the dark. When it ended, the silence was slow to return, broken only by the faint groan of the forest in the cold. Harris stayed crouched, his rifle still ready, eyes locked on the tree line. "They're feeling for the weakest point," he said at last. "And when they find it, they won't stop." Evans nodded, gripping his weapon tighter. The night wasn't over. In Bastogne it never really was. The morning broke with a brittle, biting cold that seemed sharper than any day before. The air was so dry it stung the inside of Evans's nose with every breath, and the snow crunched under even the smallest movement. The light was flat, turning the world into a pale sheet where depth and distance were hard to judge. Harris was already on watch, his posture rigid, scanning the tree line with a precision that came from too many nights expecting it to move. The field ahead looked untouched, but Evans knew that was a lie. Snow-covered tracks filled shell holes and erased signs of the living and the dead alike, but it didn't change what had been there hours before. There was no runner again, no food, no word from command. It had been long enough now that the absence felt less like delay, and more like abandonment. The hunger didn't gnaw anymore. It pressed, slow and heavy, dulling his thoughts, and making his muscles ache, as if they were filled with lead. Around mid-morning, a sound drifted across the snow, deep, muted and steady. At first Evans thought it was wind, but it was too rhythmic. Engines. Multiple. Harris heard it too, tilting his head slightly to catch the pattern. It grew for a while, then faded, only to return from a different angle, as though the machines were circling. The air carried another warning soon after, the faint, metallic tang of fresh gunpowder. It wasn't the lingering ghost of a fight far away. It was close, maybe even in the tree line itself. By afternoon, the light had already begun to drain from the sky, the clouds pressing low and heavy. Both men prepared for the night without speaking. Ammunition was laid out in careful order, weapons checked again and again, frozen walls packed tighter. When the dark came, it came fast. The first flare rose almost immediately from somewhere to their right, bathing the snow in a harsh white light. Evans could see them this time, figures emerging from the trees in staggered lines, moving quickly and low. Harris fired, the sound cracking through the cold, and Evans followed. The enemy's return fire was instant, sharper and closer than before. Bullets cut through the snow-packed air, snapping branches, and kicking up white bursts just feet from the Foxhole. The fight surged harder than any night before, the enemy pressing close enough that Evans caught glimpses of faces under helmets. The firing didn't taper as quickly this time. It lingered, pushing them to shift positions, to adjust angles, to keep moving despite the cold that gripped their muscles. When it finally stopped, the silence was thin and tense, like a rope pulled too tight. Harris didn't lower his rifle, his eyes fixed on the tree line, as if daring it to move again. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low but certain, "they'll come for real." Evans knew he was right. The line had been tested enough. It was only a matter of when the storm would break. The night after Harris's words felt like it had been carved out of ice and silence. Evans stayed awake through most of it, not because he wanted to, but because something in the air kept him from letting go. Even when his eyes grew heavy, the smallest creak of a branch or shift in the wind pulled him back. Harris barely moved, crouched low, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze never leaving the tree line. The cold was worse than usual, sharp, biting, the kind that seemed to freeze the very air in your lungs. By the time the first thin gray of morning seeped into the sky, Evans felt like the hours had stretched into days. The field ahead was once again a blank page of snow, unmarked and undisturbed, but there was nothing innocent about it. Somewhere under that smoothness lay the path of boots, the weight of gear, the traces of men who had been just out of sight. No runner came. No sound from the rear. The hunger was no longer even a separate sensation. It had become part of him, as constant as the cold. Around mid-morning the first sound came, a deep, rolling thud from far off. Then another, closer. Harris's head tilted, his expression sharpening. Artillery, he said, though Evans had already guessed. The rhythm grew, steady now, closing in. By early afternoon, the air itself began to hum with the pressure of it. Then the wind shifted, carrying voices, shouted commands in German, closer than they had ever heard them. Harris adjusted his position, every movement slow and deliberate. "This is it," he said simply. The light drained quickly from the sky, and darkness fell like a curtain. The first flare went up, almost immediately, its pale light washing over the snow and the trees beyond. This time there was no pause, no slow testing. Figures surged from the tree line in force, rifles and machine guns chattering in unison. Harris's first shot was clean, dropping one before the man could clear the open. Evans fired again and again, the recoil pounding into his shoulder, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Bullets tore into the snow around them, splintered the frozen rim of the foxhole, snapped branches overhead. The enemy pressed hard, closing the distance in bursts, vanishing into cover, then appearing again closer still. Harris worked with the same cold precision as always, every shot deliberate. Evans's hands were numb, but the rifle felt like part of him now, moving on instinct. The fight stretched into what felt like hours, the dark lit in brief, violent flashes. When the firing finally eased, it wasn't because they had broken the attack, it was because the enemy had melted back into the trees, leaving the field as empty as it had been at dawn. Evans sat back against the wall, chest heaving, his breath plumbing in the cold air. Harris stayed crouched, eyes still on the tree line. "If we're here tomorrow," he said, "it'll start again." Evans didn't answer, he knew it would. In Bastogne there was no such thing as the last night, only the next one.